Can you all hear me okay? Good. There you go. Jim's going to make it official and ring the bell. Jim's going to make it official and ring the bell. Morning, everyone. Welcome to our adult Bible class. We are continuing our study of Job this morning. We are in chapter 42, and we're halfway through it, so there's a really good chance we're going to finish Job today. But, as always, I never guarantee that because you know how sometimes I get to talking and we just don't get there. So, before we begin, David's going to lead us in a prayer before our study.
Our God, we're thankful for the opportunity we have now to study more of your word. We pray that you'll help each of us have a full mind to better understand your word. And we pray now that you'll encourage the rest of our class. We pray also for the ones that weren't able to make it out this morning because of illness. We pray that you'll get them to live better and that you will let us come back with us. We pray now that you will send our class this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.
Yeah, thank you, David. So we wrapped up last week looking at verses 4 through 6. And this was Job responding again to God, again in a very humble mode. Okay? And he reminds, he prefaces it with some things that these were the questions you asked me, God. And instead of being in that attitude that, hey, I really want this audience with God and we're going to go to court and I'm going to argue my case, he's saying, these are the questions you posed to me, God, and if you give me a moment, there is something I want to say, but it has nothing to do with my attitude before. I realize my position relative to you, okay? And we wrapped up with, on that, the talk about Job's comment, in our, the ESV that I read from. He said, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. And we talked about that in the New King James Version. He'd said, I will, this was back to verse 4. It says, hear and I will speak. And we've talked about the fact that if you just read that and didn't look at other translations, you might think that Job was kind of coming with a little bit of attitude again. Listen to me, I'm going to talk. And that's really not what he's saying here. He's saying, listen, please, you asked me, or you said to me, I'll question you and you shall answer me, right? So Job is humbly asking God to hear what he has to say here. And again, it's not a contention with God. So we went on to talk about the fact that we could translate part of what he said here as that he retracts many of the things that he said. We talked about the fact that during his conversations with his three friends, and we put that term friends very loosely, that he had said some things over the course of that now he regrets and he'd like to take back. And we talked about, and I asked you guys your ideas on what things he might take back, what things he might not take back. So we talked about the fact that he probably would not take back the fact that he disagreed with his friends. And that was an accurate decision on his part to not take that back. God's going to go on to say that Job was right in not agreeing with his friends, that they don't have any more clue about it than anybody else. They're as wrong as anyone. Talked about that he probably would take back the fact that he had cursed that he was ever born. In other words, not appreciating the life that God had given him. He would take that back now, given the chance. He'd probably take back the fact that he said, I would really just like to die and be done with this. Again, not appreciating the life that God had given him, and he recognizes that now. How about the various challenges he had offered up before God? I want to see him in court. I want to speak to his face. He'll recognize I'm right if I have that chance. That's another one he'd want to take back at this point if he could. And then we wrapped up with, we were just talking about allowing himself to lose hope and how he probably feels a little bit embarrassed and ashamed now that he had allowed himself to give up hope, knowing that God would always be there with him, and yet he had lost that at some point. reality is I don't think God is terribly disappointed with him in that. Not that he doesn't get disappointed when we lose hope, but he recognizes we're human beings and we're fallible, right? And sometimes we can be overcome. But here Job is in such a different frame of mind now that he has restored that relationship with God, and that's exactly what God would ask of us, right? Those times when we're in despair, when we feel we're overwhelmed, that's the time to restore our relationship with God, to come to him for strength. And this is what Job is experiencing at this point. I thought of this, this idea that he was swallowed in despair, and I don't think I got to talk about this one. These were the two notes I didn't get to touch on last week. Comparing that to what Job had said in chapter 1, verse 21, where it says, "And he said," meaning Job, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Though he slay me, I will hope in him." So early on in this encounter, in this whole series of events in Job's life, he was determined that whatever happened, that he would not lose hope, that he knew God was with him, right? And then that's what I think led to the fact that I've talked about numerous times now, that the greatest loss that Job suffered in this whole series of events was that sense that he had a relationship with God. That was the greatest loss to him. And then the last thing I had down here that he probably would like to take back was that he had spoken in error because of his ignorance. Again, we can only speak, or our wisdom and intelligence is based on what we know, and our knowledge is certainly imperfect compared to God's. And this is a point when Job has realized this in his own life. I spoke based on what I knew, and obviously I know very little compared to you to God. And he'd like to take some of those things back. So that brings us to verses 7 through 9. But if you don't mind, we're going to go back and reread the whole chapter just so that we have the whole context of what we're going to study today. It's not that long. So I'm going to start in 42, verse 1. "Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "My anger burns against you and against your two friends. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job pray for you, for I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly. For you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." So Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then came to him all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before, and ate bread with him in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him. And each of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. And he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he called the name of the first daughter Jemima, and the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third, this one's tough, Kerenapuk. You could probably do better than that. And in all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. And after Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons 4 generations, and Job died an old man, full of days. All right, so we're going to pick up in verse 7 through 9. This is where God turns and speaks to Eliphaz and gives his declaration about these events to Eliphaz. So God, now satisfied that Job has learned from the lessons that he's presented, turns his attention to some of the other key figures of the book, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. No additional mention is made regarding the other figures of the story. Who else can you think of that we have encountered here? Elihu? Anyone else? Job's wife. And I think of one other character we've talked about here, who's been prominent through this whole book, very active. Satan, right? So nothing is said about any of those characters, but he turns to these 3. I'm left curious. We're not told. He speaks here to Eliphaz. Could the other 3 hear what God was saying to Job as God addressed Job personally? That'd be a curiosity for me. We're not told. If they could, I'd be starting to get nervous if I were them, because their expectation was that God was going to set Job into his place for being wrong, and that's not how that conversation went. So when God turns to them, I'd be a little nervous. On the other hand, if they can't hear any of this conversation other than what Job is saying, they're probably thinking Job's crazy at this point. He's just talking to the air, right? And to just kind of put that in perspective, I compared that to the experience of Paul or Saul on the road to Damascus when he encountered the Lord. The people around him could hear a voice. It doesn't say if they could understand what was being said, but they could hear something. They could not see what Saul saw, but they could hear a noise. They could hear a voice. So again, don't know if they know. Yes, sure.
As he's speaking to Job, because the next verse, he then turns his attention to him. And so it's like if you're speaking to a group, you might be pointing directly at someone at one point of it, but then you can start talking a broader spectrum.
Sure.
But that's just an assumption.
Right, yeah, thank you, George. Again, like I say, I'm not telling you it's one way or the other. That's just one of the things that jumps into my mind as I read this. Were they all privy to the whole conversation or not? Yes. Yes, yeah. Very good, thank you. So we're now turning to where God addresses Eliphaz directly. He's not pleased with him. He's not pleased with his 2 friends. And why? Because they had spoken about God, or presumably for God, in error. Okay? Can we be in danger of that ourselves? Certainly. If we're too full of ourselves and have too high opinion of our own knowledge, we can easily say things to people about their standing with God that are untrue as well, right? So that's why it's important for us to do our best to study and to come to as good an understanding of the Word as we possibly can, and not simply go on a cursory reading or I heard it one time and I believe that's what it means, right? We need to study. Let's see, they believed they were defending wisdom against Job's folly, only to be told in no uncertain terms who was the one committing folly. Eliphaz and his friends. That's not to claim that Job spoke nothing in error. He had acknowledged his mistakes earlier, but his three friends in their exchanges had also misrepresented God. No doubt this comes as a surprise to them. Now again, this gets back to my question about whether they heard the whole conversation, right? If this is the first thing they're hearing is God directly addressing them, then they have no idea what's coming. If they've been hearing the whole conversation with Job, then they probably have a sense of what's coming, right? In his judgment of them. They had been convinced they were speaking on God's behalf, and that's a mistake we need to avoid. God instructed him to prepare a sacrifice. He's told to take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and this would suggest that their errors were sinful. Do we have examples of sacrifices being made? Yes, there are free will offerings and so forth, but generally a sacrifice is made as an atonement for sin, is it not? So if God is telling them to offer a sacrifice, it would seem that God is considering their misrepresentation of him as a sin that needs to be atoned for. What sin, so we talk about sometimes the 7 deadly sins, what sin do you think this probably falls under? Pride, yeah. Their belief that they knew something, right? And as Jordan pointed out, it's not just to be a sacrifice, but they have to take it to whom? Job. They're going to have to take it to Job and ask him to offer a prayer on their behalf. God says that he's going to accept the prayer of Job on their behalf, implying at this point that if they did the sacrifice themselves and offered these prayers, God may not accept that, right? Otherwise, why would Job have to be involved here? Do you think there's additional motive why that they have to go to Job for this? Yes.
So I think that part of that is after all those harsh things they had said to Job, I think that's part of not only do you have to ask for forgiveness and show that you're sorry, he has to accept that.
Jim, you had your hand up.
This is similar to what I'm thinking what Haman had to do when he had to parade Mordecai through the streets of town to proclaim that this is the one that the king chose to honor, when Mordecai wanted to be him. These 3 guys wanted to be right. I know best, and turns out just like Mordecai, I'm just like Haman, you're embarrassed.
Yeah. Thank you. Very good ideas. I'm also going to throw out to you this one. What do you think the status of Job's relationship with his 3 friends would have been at this point, at the end of these events? If we just ended here, do you think that would still be a good friendship? Not likely, right? I understand that, but as a human nature would be that we would be bitter toward one another, would we not? Certainly for Job, and these are the things that are answered by God, we would feel vindicated in that our friends were not really our friends. This is an opportunity for him to reconcile these friends. I think in part, not in total, but at all. But there's an aspect of it here where it's the opportunity to restore this relationship. is it not? As Kelly said, the three friends get an opportunity to essentially acknowledge to Job that they've been wrong and, admit their error, right? Go to them and make it right. Yeah. You can't be right with me when you're wrong with your brother, right? You can't love me if you can't love the images of me that I've placed around you, right? Very good. Thank you. Yeah, yeah. I think that goes both ways.
Kind of alluded to was this, God, he said to, you need to forgive and forget, which, like I say, human nature sometimes can be extremely difficult. Because we have a tendency to forget human nature plays a role too.
Yeah. And I have a note here that said, I think this is an excellent passage to consider when people suggest today that we in the churches of Christ are too legalistic. That's a term they like to use. We're too legalistic. Instead of accepting that God is love and he loves everyone and everyone's going to heaven, right? Y'all are too legalistic, following rules. Baptism? Ha, that's legalism. It tells us we need to catch up with the times. But God makes it clear here that those who teach about him in error cannot expect God's favor. If they never repent, they can never expect his forgiveness. So we need to be on guard. The world changes its views on what God's relationship is with us. God's view of his relationship with us never changes. What he tells us is what is the truth, right? So we always need to be on guard to tell the truth, even if it's not popular. It is the truth. To their credit, the three quickly comply in verse 9 with God's instructions. Job obviously offers prayers on their behalf, and God accepts the prayers as he had promised that he would do. I found it interesting that 4 times in these couple of verses, God calls Job his servant. How did God describe Job to Satan when we opened this study in the beginning chapters? Have you considered my servant, Job? So we've had this, here's the bookends. At the beginning, God brings up Job because he is a faithful servant. Here at the end, we have God pointing out again, Job is a faithful servant of mine. Not perfect. None of us are called to be perfect. We're called to be faithful servants. Does Job here represent a type or a foreshadowing of what Christ would be? One who was willing to intercede with God on behalf of those who had been so cruel to him. Is that not exactly what Christ did for us? I'm not comparing Job to Christ, don't get me wrong. But it's a lesson God is teaching. Even those who are cruel to you, you need to do your best to bring to a right relationship with me. And that's true for each of us. And then my last little note on this. This is a really tough personal question. If you were Job, if I were Job, could I have done it? Again, we get that back to that human nature, right? I would have probably been pretty bitter with these 3 friends. It had been a challenge to accept that I was the one responsible for restoring their relationship with God. It's the right thing to do. But as a human being, that's a challenge to get past. And that's something we all need to examine in our own lives each day when we encounter people who are not our favorite people. It is still our mission to do our best to help them come to a right relationship with God, regardless. Before we move on, any comments or questions on those verses? All right. Verses 10 and 11. No idea why I'm losing my voice, but good thing I don't have to speak later. So here we have the account of God restoring the things that Job had, and not just what he had, but in addition, right? God had already restored Job to the thing that he valued most, and that was a closeness with God and the sense of God's presence. Again, I've spoken over and over that I think that was Job's greatest difficulty here, was that loss. Job could have been satisfied with that. In reality, he seems like a fairly humble man here who recognizes his position. And in reality, God probably could have stopped right there and Job would have been satisfied, right? But once he shows his heart and his willingness to obey God by praying for his three friends, God goes further and restores Job's material wealth and his physical relationships. Again, I had a note here about him being, he could have been bitter toward his friends, but instead he was soft-hearted and kind. But do you think maybe that's been influenced by his own experience in dealing with God here? Recognizing his own faults and his need for God to forgive him can easily help him recognize his friends' faults and his needs, Job's need to forgive them, right? Again, another lesson I think we can all take from this study. When we have difficulty forgiving other people, ask yourself if you would want God and Christ to have that same attitude toward us in our shortcomings. So his wealth is not just restored, but also his relationships with others, represented by his family. The sympathy and comfort that had been lacking for so long is now generously flowing. Recall what Job had said in chapter 19, verses 13 through 19. He has put my brothers far from me, and those who knew me are wholly estranged from me. My relatives have failed me. My close friends have forgotten me. The guests in my house and my maidservants count me as a stranger. I have become a foreigner in their eyes. I call to my servant, but he gives me no answer. I must plead with him with my mouth for mercy. My breath is strange to my wife, and I am a stench to the children of my own mother. That would be his brothers and sisters. Even young children despise me, and when I rise, they talk against me. All my intimate friends abhor me, and those whom I loved have turned against me. So those very people that Job said had all left him as a result of these tragic events are now returning, coming to him and doing their best to comfort him. The gifts that he received from them, just one second, I'll get right back to you. The gifts that he received from them was not a means of restoring Job's material wealth. Don't want you to think that. God didn't need any man to come and give Job wealth to restore things back to him. That was entirely in God's power. But these are means of honoring Job, recognizing that Job has not been a terrible man as everybody has been suggesting, and it's just a way of honoring him. Yes, Jordan.
Returning back to meeting his acquaintances, before all this happened, of course, the Nephi already went over it with them and everything. Before all this happened, people respected him. He was, young men giving up their seats for him. Like they were, of course, respecting his name. Of course, there's the opposite of that, where they use his name as a byword later on. But you can see here how everyone, the Lord is returning all of them back to him after they thought did something. And being punished was because he fell away or he sinned against God, he did something wrong. But they're just now coming back now because they're finding out the truth. You can see how quick something, or how bad a situation can go in just a few words.
Two things that came to mind to me from all of this part of it was, A, fair weather friends. So when Job was down, they weren't there to help him out, were they? But now that he's restored and it looks like things are going well for him, they're back, right? We all know people like that. The other thing that occurred to me was, and you thought cancel culture was something new, right? Here was all the people around hearing what had happened to Job, and they essentially canceled him. He was nobody now. And now suddenly things turn around and he's, right back on top in their eyes. He's never been on the bottom in God's eyes.
Even the people that were cast out, people that were looked down on, even they were making fun of him. Yeah. That's how low it made him in that class, or whatever you want to call it. Even the lowest of low was calling him, using his name as live, or just using it as a cuss word in that. Just everything returns back to what was normal for Job. That's what
Yeah, very good. All right.
a lot of respect towards him for people.
Exactly. All right. Anybody else before we move on to 12 through 15? Okay. So here it gives the details of how God restores to him not just what he had, but even more, right? And in many ways, double. So the details of the restoration of Job's material wealth include double the animals. We can compare this to what we find in chapter 1, when it told us how many animals were taken. Remember that he lost. It talked about this. So he lost 7,000 sheep, and he lost 3,000 camels, and he lost 500 yoke of oxen in the events that Satan plagued him with. Right? Now he's restored double. He has twice as many. The restoration of the same number of sons and daughters. So he has the same number of sons and the same number of daughters that he had originally. Again, I'm not going to tell you this is what this means. Just in reading commentaries, there's different ideas on, well, why didn't he get twice as many sons and daughters? Everything else was doubled. And one of the commentators made a really interesting point. Again, don't know, can't tell you if that's the fact or not, just an interesting point that he made. The animals live beyond their physical death. There's nothing to an animal, no soul, right? So once an animal dies, that's the end of it. How about a human being? What do we believe? What do we accept because God has told us about us as human beings? Is that the end of our existence when this physical body dies? No. So if you think of it in one perspective, he still has all 10 children that he has. Spiritually, they go on. He has 10 more. So from a perspective of eternal existence, he has twice as many children as he had. Unlike the animals who simply cease when their physical existence ceases. Again, just an interesting take I thought that particular commentator had on that. We're told that his daughters were beautiful, and oftentimes in the Old Testament, women are noted for their beauty more so than their abilities, right? So there wasn't as great an appreciation in this era of women and their abilities as there was for their beauty. But have you noticed we don't see that very much in the New Testament? When we speak of women in the New Testament and they're held up as positive examples or, women of note, it's not because of their physical attributes. It's because of either their abilities or their faithfulness to God. Something else that's interesting, the daughters here are said to receive a share of the inheritance, just like the sons, which was not typical in Old Testament times. Yes, true.
Big question about this book is when it took place. Whenever in class there at school, our teacher
Saying maybe it took place during the patriarchy age because of that inheritance part. Everyone getting an inheritance. And of course, it doesn't say when it, I know when it took place.
Right.
So, some assumption again.
Yeah.
But if it did take place in that patriarchal age, it gives the reason why they're getting an inheritance.
But it also was not typical for the daughters to receive in that inheritance. That's a little unusual, right? So it's not that it's the right thing to do, but it wasn't something typical. And I think that's probably why it's pointed out here. Usually it was just the sons who received it, right? And here we get the daughters actually receiving a share. And the names that are given for them, so depending on whose translations you look at and so forth, Jemimah can mean dove, turtle dove, or daybright. Keziah can be perfume, spice, or cinnamon. And Karen Hapuk was an interesting one. It means the translations were eyeshadow or horn of paint. So, who knows? Lastly, 16 to 17. We're told here that Job lived 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' for 4 generations. Again, we're not told, I don't know if the language is specific enough. You know, I've told you before, I'm no Hebrew scholar or whatever, and I couldn't tell you, right? Even if I could read the original language, I couldn't tell you exactly what was meant here. Does this mean that he lived to be 140 total, or that he lived another 140 years after these events occurred? Considering how generations tended to progress at the era we think this book exists, right, patriarchal age, men typically didn't start families till they were in their 30s, right, and having children. It'd be challenging for him to see a 4th generation born in just 70 years. So some suggest 140 is total, that he lived 70 before and he lived 70 after. Some suggest that it's 140 after and that he lived 70 before and 140 after to get double again.
After this, it could mean that after this he lived that long.
Yes.
Of course, after what just happened, all the events from chapter 1 all the way to chapter 4, verse 15, all this, after this, he did this.
Right. And I think that's the more natural reading, is that he lives 140 years after we see these events occur. Otherwise, it'd be pretty challenging, I think, to see a 4th generation. But again, you come to your own conclusions. I can't tell you definitively. What time are we at? All right, so we're not going to have time to start the intro of the post-exilic prophets, but we did finish up with Job. You guys want to bring up any general comments about the whole book? We got about 5 minutes left, Arlene. We're not told that he finds another wife. We're never told that his wife dies or leaves him, right? Yeah, and we talked about at one point during the class, why didn't Satan take these 3 friends and his wife, right? And I said, I really felt that Satan left them for a reason, because he intended to use them, right? He used his wife against Job. Why don't you just curse God and die? She's certainly not propping him up, right? Encouraging him. He used his 3 friends against him. Job, this is your fault. You've sinned. You're the one who's in the wrong. You should, it's your fault, kind of thing, right? And driving him further and further down in despair. Is it the same wife? Is it not the same wife? Good question. Wish we knew the answer. We're not told. I wondered that too. That would be another one of those instances where maybe God's asking Job to overcome that human nature, right? If you're Job, would you be thrilled to go back to that wife who had not been supportive in the time that you needed? And that works both ways. I don't want to imply it's just wives. That would be the same if the husband had been unsupportive, right? But perhaps that's another aspect of what Job is called to forgive and restore relationships. But we're not told. Thank you. Any other questions or comments you want to make? I mean, I think there's numerous wonderful lessons we can take out of this book that apply to us today, as much as as any time in history, and will always apply to people. I think number one, you take out of this right at the opening of the book: Satan is real. He's not a mythical being like the world wants to tell you. Nah, Satan doesn't really exist. That's just a mythical being. Satan exists. And he's working in our lives to try to separate us from God. That's his desire. We have a very obvious story about Job and how he worked really hard on Job, but that doesn't mean that Satan doesn't work on each and every one of us. Okay? There's an excellent lesson about being good friends. We saw 3 poor examples. And they demonstrated for us some things that we need to be careful and avoid in our own lives, right? Being too sure of what we think we know, what's going on in other people's lives, judging that in them, and thinking we have all the answers to fix everything, right? Isn't that what men are accused of being really bad about? We want to be fixers when maybe our spouse just needs to tell us about something. They're not looking for us to fix it. They just need to get it off their chest. Let that happen. Yes, Jim?
The fact that after all this, he had 10 more children. So I think his wife and he get reconciled someplace in life.
Sure. Anything else? Yes.
Well, one thing I know I talked to Jim about this before too is we always think about, the thing that struck me was when we talked about Satan in the beginning, and everybody was saying, why is he meeting with them and things like that, and you always wonder why he hates humans so much. And it got me thinking about his hate for us is probably because just speculating, he's an angel, and then God creates humans. They're with him for who knows how long. Come along humans that he puts above the angels. And it makes me ponder of, is it jealousy of why he's coming here and trying to turn us against God? Because all of that feelings. But that's just a thought that came to my mind, because you think, well, what is he doing out here?
Right.
Why does he need us so much? And that just kind of made sense in my mind.
Thanks for sharing that. All right. Well, next week we are going to start out on a study of the post-exilic prophets. So it'll be Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Those are the last 3 books of the Old Testament. Next week will be an intro, and I'm guessing we'll get into Haggai because the intro only takes about 20 minutes. So I would encourage you to read Haggai. It's only 2 chapters. Took me about 10 minutes, just so you have at least in your mind an idea of who we're going to be talking about. Thank you all for your great participation today.